footprint. I guess one always ends up leaving some footprint. I would hope at the moment, my hope is that almost all of my work, whether it's writing or artworks or something else, are mostly just driven by like an itch that some sort of idea produces or some kind of like coherence or incoherence that I kind of feel about something that I'm thinking, an idea, a concept, experience, observation as history, and a desire to, if not resolve that incoherence, at least to kind of investigate its its irony or its contradiction, or if it's a contradiction at all, or if it's only one perspective, it's a contradiction making sense. I guess at the moment, I'm quite invested in an attempt to try and make sense out of a lot of things, and the world doesn't get any less confusing or nonsensical. And so I'm hoping that by trying to make sense of things, I also leave some footprints, as you might call them, or other artifacts that help others to do so. That's one way for me to rationalize, what is ultimately in some ways art is a very, you know, unhelpful field in some ways. Like obviously we can make arguments for how kind of transcendent and important or whatever it is, but so in terms of rationalizing my desire to satisfy my own curiosities and understand, um, I try to create things that maybe also facilitate other people's ability to do that, I guess. Um, in terms of like impact, I mean that framing I always struggle with a bit because it does wake me up a bit to like, oh shit, what impact actually do I have on anything? And what should I sort of, choose to have? I think, you know, it's in a way, otherwise it's a way the usual I kind of, by making sense or trying to map and explore my way through situations, I also create, I hope, a community and an idea and, you know, forms of solidarity or forms of knowledge or forms of practices. I guess I think of art making as fundamentally a way of trying to bring new concepts into the world, not at all always successfully or meaningfully, but nonetheless, like attempt, and the good ones stick and reframe things and you know, change the setting on reality. Um, that's part of the hope. But yeah, in terms of wider impacts, like in terms of very measurable or, change hearts and minds and like change the course of history, I don't really think in those terms. Yeah, so you're talking about the interview with Christine Skinner, who's an astrologer. I say she's in her like 60s, maybe 70s, based in the city of London. By the point where I met Christine, I'd already spent some time like interviewing, working with, almost started making a film with another New York-based astrologer of a similar age and sort of pedigree called Henry Weingarten. So in many ways, I was, not remotely surprised by financial astrology or any of the things that she was actually working on. And what I was maybe interested in or like, you know, ready to be surprised by or kind of curious about was the way that she approached it, the sort of person that's um, the sort of skill sets and life that led to this very peculiar intersection between kind of like an epistemic intersection between different kinds of very far away. The reason financial astrology is, in one way, financial astrology shouldn't be remotely surprising because of the long history of these kinds of things. In another sense, it's highly surprising because of, how those different subcultures, and sociologically, it's very surprising. Like subculturally, it's very surprising sense of like why the sorts of people who end up in finance, the sorts of people who end up like being deep in astrology. And so I was kind of curious how he ended up there. It turns out it was mostly because I think she was already practicing astrology as a musician, and the Tokyo crisis in the late 80s was such a kind of alarming astrological set of signals that, at least in her words, if you didn't, anticipate something going on there, then you don't deserve to call yourself a financial astrologer, which I think actually was the trigger point for Henry in New York as well. And so then I was like, oh wow, there's like there's a kind of science to this. There's a kind of correlation and a way of these two ways of looking at the world have their own internal logics, internal rigors that it kind of made sense, especially in that moment. And then, you know, ultimately these two kind of ways of mapping time, if you like, um, could come together. Other than that, I guess I was quite I think everyone who reads it might be moderately surprised or alarmed at least at her kind of extremely morbid predictions for like 2026. I think it was. Yeah, she's a really wonderful person. Really like just a delightful person and really wise and interesting. The only other thing I was surprised by this point was that she really emphasized, like with Henry, the put it simply, the use of computers, like the fact that um, personal computers and then astronomy software had meant that the practice of astrology had escalated massively from what was previously consulting various almanacs and historical documents and various tables of like geometries and stuff, I believe, to something that was done much, much more quickly, calculatively through just normal computers. And that meant that the amount of data that you were working with, the amount of like, if you were modeling on some level, the amount of data you're modeling by was also increasing massively, which gave me this kind of like image that um, for them, there's there because the same thing is happening typically in finance, or at least like finance reuses is find correlations in such a kind of large body of data. So like the astrologer in this case, I think just basically has two Bloomberg style terminals where they're kind of paying attention to these like massive fire hoses of possible data points that have possibly useful correlation to glean from them. Which that's just very different from what people would have done in like I don't know, the 1970s or 1920s or something. Uh, Intuitively, I would assume that the majority of the world, which is now made up of the unit of politics in the world, is in some sense a sovereign nation state, and most of the experience of like peoples, nations in the world, um, is not the experience of Britain or France or even Germany. Actually, Germany is quite new, and certainly not like the experience of like China or Iran or um, these or like I guess Egypt. There's certain nations like if we all consider all nations to be fictions of a kind, certain nations which can hold to a certain idea of continuity in time, almost by human terms, civilizational, thousands of years, something like that. The majority of nation states have a relatively, have a much, much more mixed, entangled, constantly colonized, if you want to use the colonial framework, because in some places it's almost like when you talk about decolonization, it's like it's never really not being non-colonized, so to speak. So it's kind of permanent state is in that. Or at least there's a temporal peculiarity I feel like that is now being reactivated in the image of like a multipolar world, in the image of a kind of reshifting of global political alignments, where we're kind of calling upon these different images of the state of sovereignty, which have a really complex relationship to time, like the way in which different geographical and civilizational kinds of mythologies are reasserting themselves. And they have some element of truth to them in the sense that they have cultural truth and they have probably some like actual geographical kind of like orders to them. But yeah, I guess the thinking about time as an institutionalized technology of capitalism is maybe part of what was the point of the book. But now also thinking about time that actually breaks out of that is not to do with not merely the time of the stock market or merely the time of central banks or whatever, but actually the time of this deeper, often powerful and truthful, but also often deeply reactionary cultural politics, the time of civilizations, for example, is an example of I guess, of a clash between two styles or modes of temporality, and the latter one is yeah, I feel like is now kind of you know, rearing its head a lot more in terms of how we deal with it. And it's not really a good or bad or right or wrong situation. They're both um, complicated to say the least. But it's that, yeah, in terms of where my own thinking has shifted about where my kind of focal attention has shifted in terms of this question of time, I think it's gone a bit that way. Um, Between fiction and what is the opposite of fiction? Is it fact? Is it reality? I guess the easier opposition would be something like fact. A fact is, you could broadly define a fact as a kind of an independent truth, a truth that doesn't depend on subjective experience, one that is relatively neutral in whichever way you want to put it. And that, so one way to think about this would be through the fact, and then the fact itself has a history. Like the fact becomes a usable independent truth through, I mean, I think Lorraine Daston, no, I can't remember who writes, Mary Poovey writes about this. And throughout, I hate the phrase kind of throughout history, because I don't know what that means necessarily, but in a lot of historical cultures and at different points in history, you have you get along fine with reality. We all live in reality without the use of facts as such. You use things that you might go closer to stories, intuitions, sort of collective narratives, subjective truths, whatever you want to call them. So that's the kind of, so guess I think of fiction as mostly defined as in opposition to a fact. And it's obviously, one can say that has to do with an imaginary experience. It has to do with something that is somehow more subjective or more kind of synthetic or artificial than what reality truthfully should be if reality were asubjective. But then the situation of humans is that reality is always mediated, even by our own nervous system and whatever. So that makes the kind of fiction distinction possible. Fantasy, I think I use that word not so often, but when I use it, I think I'm using it in mostly a psychoanalytic sense, in the sense that people like everyone from like, I don't know, Slavoj Žižek to Laurent Berlin, these kind of vaguely psychoanalytic thinkers might think of it, which has to do with what holds together a scene for, what holds together the scene of my life that makes me feel like a coherent human being, that gives me a story that I can tell myself to myself, that sort of somehow makes sense to me and doesn't cause me to feel incoherent and fragmented and dissociated and so on. And so I think I opened the book with this stuff about psychosis, and that has something to do with the kind of either the fragmentation or the maybe the disappearance or the replacement of your fantasy for a fantasy that is not coherent to anyone else. But I think of fantasy that way. It's much more intimate connections with how to constitute a subjectivity. And so I think I use fantasy in the book, in the main essay in the book, mostly in relation to the kind of expectation that's what Berlin calls like cruel optimism, the kind of expectation of the good life, whether or not, even if your life sucks and you're in a terrible place, your will to exist in some ways is held up by some notion, some fantasy of what goodness means, or what a good life, what it means to live okay, what it means to live well, and so on. And that itself is sustained by various changing, shifting social, historical, economic reasons. And what happens when the fantasy or the good life that we are formed by is no longer attainable by the kind of historic conditions in which we live, and what happens when, like, those two things are basically have a significant like rupture between them is what I was thinking about in terms of like catastrophe, or at least one of the kind of valences of that term. The fact fiction thing broadly in terms of like states and stuff, I mean, I'm not saying that everything is a fiction in the sense that everything is doesn't matter because it's made up. I'm saying that everything is made up, and that really, really matters, and we have to make things up in order to live. And all of those fictions, to varying degrees, come to matter. And we now live in a world in which, for a bunch of reasons, it's harder and harder to tell what is or isn't made up and what does or doesn't matter. Um, and I guess I see part of my own interest is in trying to articulate how, how things come to matter, and perhaps the mistakes that we make, when we use use the old lens to apply to the new situation, what we miss in a way. To give a really simplistic version, I I was born in the early 90s. I grew up in a situation, I was born in China, I grew up in the UK, and I grew up in a situation where, for instance, because I had academic interests to some degree, being an academic, working in a university, that was a good job. That was an ideal of how you could be a respectable member of society or whatever, and also maybe pursue something and also have a living, a good living. And that was like, you can do a bunch of things, and that's one of the things you can do. By the time, and maybe I'll do a PhD, I thought to myself, like probably throughout my like undergrad years or whatever. And by the time I was in my like mid to late 20s, it's not that, I'm still considering, like it's not that it's not viable, but it is true that institutions in that category of like employment or whatever are completely crumbling. And it is a kind of like, it is a special vocation, a very, very special vocation now, I think, to become, especially an academic in the humanities, because your life is not going to be very easy to deal with. Not and never mind the kind of discursive legacy of the humanities over the last 50 years, which has arguably contributed to the kind of political shit show that we're also in now. But so there is a difference in aspiration, expectation from when I was younger and where I see things now, for example. And that would be a kind of gap in a way, like in when in terms of like generational gaps, if I think about myself and younger generations, I'm like a young millennial, I guess, in that, or whatever you call those. Um, I was lucky-ish to grow up on the transitional point of the internet. By the time I was, 6 or 7, the internet existed, or like, commonly. But nonetheless, I knew a world before after. I knew a world when it was slow. I saw the world like become totally informatized in that way over my lifetime. I also, that similar lifetime is also roughly the period of like peak globalization, let's say, the period since the 90s and about 2020, when like the narrative of globalization and the end of history had its arc, from the beginning of, let's say, Fukuyama's kind of moment and fall of the Soviet Union to, let's say, the kind of new Cold War situation. I don't It's not exactly how I want to think about it, but that's just for simplicity's sake, let's say the kind of New Cold War kind of circumstances that emerged after the 22 war and so on. And so there are these various periodizations that I'm kind of inclined to make. I'd say that my generation, or at least my cohort, um, still has a lingering amount of respect for for institutions, or for like a certain idea of the kind of legacy institutional world of like scholarship, of what it means to be to study, and to an idea of critique that was very strong, of course, in the kind of like second half of the 20th century, especially. I was still brought up very much on those thinkers. Um, I also see that it's also very easy for me and my generation to see that, wow, we really spent 40 years fastidiously creating an industry of esoteric thinkers who critique capitalism while everything got worse. Like we thought, there's also a kind of, I can point the finger of blame generationally in some ways and say like, well, you guys had it pretty good, and like you made a lot of like, intellectualized kind of frameworks for this, for the bad thing, and here we are in the bad thing. Like you know, that's the kind of millennial to Gen X, I guess, kind of like distinction. If I look to the generation after me, I mean, I try to be optimistic, to like whatever Gen Z, Zoomers, Gen Alpha, whatever you call them. I try to be optimistic. There's a huge amount that they have connectivity to, that like I do, but and that they learn. But there's also a kind of very because we're so overpowered and saturated um, by social media, essentially. It sounds really banal, but that's the main thing that we are kind of neurologically linked to through various interfaces with each other, because they're so saturated by that. It does produce, insane attention difficulties at very least, which I also feel like I find it harder and harder to read a book in a sustained way, in the way that I probably did when I was much younger. It creates like the mental health aspect of this, which I don't even think it was mental health. I think it's just like a neuro kind of neurotransmitter hacking dimension of technology in the last 20 years. Um, and the question of how we actually design, how do we govern, how do we shape that, how do we make policy for that, even towards somewhat healthier, or towards constructive ends that we actually want. That feels like one of the major questions that I think is not being very well answered. And that kind of leads me on to the other thing you were asking about, which is this kind of like these old lenses, new lenses kind of thing. When I say that, what I mean is I think we have a political situation which is still what is politics? If we think politics is the set of institutions by which we do democracy via voting and parliament or whatever in the UK or in the US or something, that's one relatively limited view of politics. There's another like set of politics which has to do with like, what bodies have agency in us wider society. And there you have a much, much wider view of politics, which includes not only obviously corporate actors and technology platforms and other human beings, but also kind of trans-individual forms of agency. Like just the daily news is colored by swarms of activity that have to do with algorithmic emergent coordination of individual subjects, which have nothing to do with their status as liberal, individual, humanist political subjects in the kind of like traditional political theoretic sense, in the kind of Enlightenment Habermasian kind of tradition. And I sometimes joke that like everyone online is like a part-time BTS fan, a 5% Nazi, a kind of like a boring kind of like Quora user or whatever. Like we're kind of constantly our agency or our presence, and therefore our presence of the algorithm or our agency within a digitally mediated sphere is constantly divided up. I mean, Deleuze famously wrote about this in the 90s, the control society stuff. Like it's kind of constantly shifted, divided up, and recombined. I recently thought about it mostly in terms of like, I was thinking about coining the surimi sphere. You know, surimi, it's like when all the fish bits get made into fish balls, it's like all the kind of excess fish that get like blended up and stuff. We kind of live in the surimi sphere, algorithmically, neurally. And so on top of that, that if that is the view of politics, then that is a view of politics which our traditional lens of politics that says like, oh, who am I voting for in parliament today, does not usually account for. Like it is missing a huge sort of segmentation, if you like, of like how at least I would think that like cultural and political agency, how power is transacted in society. And then on top of that, this kind of highly recombinatorial digital kind of life, we have, when you talk about Gen Z or Gen Alpha, you're talking about a generation that is not just born into that scene, but it's also, it produces its identity in that scene. It has its adolescence in that scene, which means it's like the kind of, it constructs its identity through this, a very, feedback driven kind of process of like the experimental quality of identity production as human adolescents, for example, I think is a really interesting question about how that happens when such a large amount of our kind of psychological and like subjective life is carried out in network spaces which are very, very different from how subjects are produced in like largely physical social space, for instance. And so that would be like a pretty big generational distinction, I'd say, even between my generation, who are only somewhat online when we were little kids forming our brains, and like a new generation who is like probably like, I was thinking recently that you should have on Twitter and on these kind of platforms, I don't think people should have to use their real names, but somehow they should have to use their real ages. So I know when I'm talking to a 12-year-old and when I'm talking to a 50-year-old, because I think that really matters. I think there are 50-year-olds arguing with 12-year-olds and possibly being bettered by them, but you simply, because you don't know, and you think that, oh my God, these, like, the world is full of like crazy people and crazy opinions and like, oh my God. Um, yeah, anyway, like as a society for various political, economic, whatever, all sorts of reasons, um, I guess we have reason to be optimistic. Whether or not everyone demographically is doing well, there's a sense in which the society feels that it is looking forward to something that is better tomorrow than it had yesterday. And today we can make this distinction quite easily between, I mean, there are a lot of other factors to compare, I'm sure, but between, let's say, the US and China. Like in the US, I don't think that feeling of a sort of optimism has carried through since probably, God knows, like 1990s, I guess, meaningfully. And I think the kind of intense, resentful resurgence of like reactionary politics is, not has a lot to do with that. And the fact that like the far right nationalists in the US, someone made a really funny point recently. A lot of times the far right nationalists, the far right in the US, the kind of MAGA sphere is like dreaming of what America could be, and for some reason their image of what America could be is actually kind of like white kids having fun at Woodstock. It's like a really interesting historical moment where you're taking like counterculture. Yeah, there's a kind of, everyone's sexy because they have to be sexy, right? You have to be hot and sexy and free. And so they're actually looking at the summer of love and like, this is not very trad Catholic of you to be like dreaming of the summer of love as your like ideal version of the white replacement, the white return in the US. Anyway, and then you look at China where like, for all of its authoritarianism, a huge number of people have gone from extreme poverty to not poverty. A lot of people are not rich, but they can see around them other people getting better lives. And if you go to rural parts of China, there is, you know, broadly, this is partly anecdotal just because I was surprised when it seemed to be true. There's a lot of optimism. People can be very, very poor and feel very optimistic about what is going to happen because they see their children, for example, going and making way more money than or like having better lives or whatever than they might have. So when I say good and bad, I just mean like I'm super bad at moral kind of like fixed categories, but I do think that like whether a whether there's obviously things just about like being able to live a reasonably free and well kind of life, but also like whether a society feels seems to feel broadly through its narratives of itself that it has something, it has a future. I think that's an interesting problem for the West, but also for Britain. It just happens because that's where I'm right now. It's quite hard to imagine a constructive future for Britain. You can say like go into your retirement phase as like a late stage empire or like a post empire or something. But in terms of like constructing what would be a hopeful vision, a narrative vehicle for here after the politics we've had over the last 20 years or whatever, and going into the economic situation that we are now as a small island on the edge of Europe, which is trapped between China and the US in terms of its like conditions, it's very hard to kind of say, I'm gonna give you a picture that doesn't feel like that feels kind of if not optimistic or like, but at least like constructive. How does in a dumb sense, how does the kind of really invisible really shape the visible, if you like, in a kind of slightly simplified metaphorical sense, or how does the kind of these great infrastructural situations, how do they um, change our the most private, psychosocial, spiritual, even mystical experience of the world? In a way, I think that's deeply what I'm trying to work out, or like not work. I don't think I'll ever work it out, but try to kind of swim in those different currents. And I think I'm very much interested in the idea of I'm spiritually, you could say. I guess I'm probably like a monist. Like I do think of a kind of immanence to matter, to such that the most interior and the most kind of ephemeral kind of private experience is in some way connected to one's materiality within in a kind of universal materiality. It sounds like simultaneously almost like both Marxist and mystical at the same time, I guess, if you like. And I guess I'm really invested in the question of how the changing of matter, which you could call technology, the shaping of matter, or the shaping of matter changes our cosmological kind of impulses, changes our kind of ability to, in the most fundamental way, feel and tell stories about ourselves, to ourselves, and of much, much larger circumstances. I don't know if that makes for a kind of a spiritual kind of dimension purely, but I feel like that's some kind of that's my universalism, I guess.